Hello everyone and welcome back to ASP.NET Core 1.0. My name is Steve Bishop, and in this video we're going to talk about routing. So a typical URL request is going to look something like this, where we have the HTTP protocol that's being called for, although you might be using HTTPS for an SSL or TLS encrypted connection. Then you have the host, and this would be either the server address with the port number or a domain, that sort of thing. Now, those two parts of the address are managed by your network and server, so they're not really part of the ASP.NET Core or MVC stack. After our protocol and host, we have a / and then home. And the home part of this is in reference to our controller, or the user wants to go to the home controller. And then on the home controller, we're looking for the index action. Now, MVC is managing this particular part of the request, the controller and action section. But how does MVC know where to send this request to based upon the user's controller and action request? Well, that would be through a routing template. And a routing template is just simply going to be a string that looks like this: controller inside the curly braces, / and then the action inside curly braces. Now, there are different formats that we can put in a template that allows a bit more flexibility. So we could also set some defaults. And in this case, controller equals home would mean if somebody doesn't supply us with a controller, just use the home controller. And if somebody doesn't supply us with an action, then use the index action. And that's what we saw in the previous video. The default was home and the default was index for the controller and action. But there's also another step you could take. You could also include a third thing, which would be the parameter. And you can see ID here has a question mark after it, which indicates that it is not a required value. Okay, there is no requirement for the user to put this in. It's simply optional. So you're probably wondering, well, where do I put this routing template at? How do I define this routing template? Well, let's go ahead and hop into our Visual Studio and see where we do that at. So here we are back at our startup class, and inside of our configure method, we have our app.useMVC with default routes. So this is where we were setting up one of those default routes that we were seeing on the previous in the previous presentation here. I'm going to go ahead and comment this out, and we're going to set up our route ourselves now. So I'm going to comment that out and put in app, and now I'm going to use the extension method use MVC. And you can see that MVC, the use MVC extension method, accepts one overload, which is that I can pass along a configure routes, which is an action of iRouteBuilder, and it's a callback to configure MVC routes. So this callback is a Lambda expression that we need to pass in. And we didn't talk about Lambda expressions if you watched the basic series on C#. Don't worry if you don't understand Lambda expressions. I'm just going to go ahead and type out the code here for you, and it will make a lot more sense. You can just copy it yourself and use it to your own advantage. But once you understand the routing templates, this should be fairly easy for you to use once you use the code that I'm going to show you. But for everyone else who knows Lambda, this should be pretty self-explanatory. So let me just go ahead and finish off that method. And now I'm going to say routes goes into routes. Oops, excuse me. This needs to be in its own set here. So routes dot map route. So we're mapping a new route to the routes. And our first string parameter is name. You can see we need to pass in a name. So I'm just going to call this default. And then I need to pass in now the template. And the template is just basically what I showed you in the presentation, the PowerPoint presentation. So we're going to do controller equals, and I'm going to set the default here to home. And then a / oops, I forgot the end curly brace, there we go. And then our action is going to be index. And there we go. So we've set our default route then for using in MVC. Let's go ahead and save this. And now using this new default route, let's just go ahead and run our application. So sure enough, hi there, Steve Bishop is what comes up. And once again, I could do home, and that comes up with the same answer. And then I could also do index, and that too comes up with the same answer. Now, if you think back to the PowerPoint presentation, there was an additional template that we had on there, and that was after the action equals index, we had / curly brace ID question mark curly brace. Now what this is an optional parameter that can also be passed in as part of the URL. Now this additional parameter of ID would be passed into the action that's being called upon. So if our default controller is home and our default action is index, we can set up a parameter on our index action now that will accept the value of ID. So we actually want to name this parameter ID. We want the name of this parameter being passed into our index action to be the same as what we're labeling it here in our default template. If I wanted to call this parm, I could do that, but you'd want to also name it parm here. And that would match between the template and what you're passing in as a parameter into your index method. So I'm going to leave this back to ID. That's typically what you want to do, is leave it ID. That's a fairly common business practice. And now what we can do is we can use this ID parameter in our view. I'm going to go ahead and add to our contact then another value here. We'll do prop int ID and save that. And I'm just going to go ahead and add ID equals ID. And we'll go ahead and save that. And now in our view, let's go ahead and use this new value. So let's go to our index razor view. We'll say you have an ID of model ID. We'll save that. And now let's go ahead and run our application. So right now the response is, hi there, Steve Bishop, you have an ID of 0. And that's because we did not pass in any value to this parameter, right? It's optional, but there is no default setting in our template. There's no default value here. So since there's no default value being passed in, it's calling a home index with no ID. Oops, let me go to the right section there. So there's no ID, but integers always have a default value of 0. So it went ahead and set ID equal to 0. But now what I can do is I can pass along here. So we'll do home index -7. And you will get a different response now. Hi there, Steve Bishop. You have an ID of 7. Now there's one more thing I want to show you, and that is you can map additional routes here by simply using the Fluent API that is on this routes object. So I'm just going to drop this down to make it a bit more legible here. And I'm going to do .map route. So we're mapping an additional route, and I'm going to call this members, because we're going to make a members section here. And we'll say controller. Oops, before we can do the controller, we actually need to make sure that the URL is going to have something different and unique from what we would expect here in our default route. Otherwise, it could be confusing. So I'm going to do members /, and now we have our reference to our controller. And we'll make this default member home and /, and we'll keep the default action index. And then let's go ahead and also add that additional ID, because we might be passing that along as a parameter. And there we go. So now we have an additional route that's been added, an additional template that is possible for our users to use. So let's go ahead and save this, and I'm going to create a whole new controller. And I'm going to call this member home. So let's do MVC controller class, member. Was it member or members? Member home. There we go. Member home controller. Get rid of the 1 there. Add it to our controllers. And I'm not going to do anything too complex. I'm not even going to use a model here. I'm just going to call this index action from our members folder here. New folder, members, member home, actually, member home. Create a new action, or excuse me, a new MVC view page. There we go. Index, and we'll just say this is the members section. Okay, so I had to go and create a view for our member home controller, and it's going to be called here whenever somebody goes to the index action on our member home controller. So let's go ahead and save that, and let's run our application. So here's our default location here. Hi there, Steve Bishop. You have an ID of 0. Now if I want to go to members and just do that, you'll see this is the members section. So we're actually able to specify different routes with different URLs that then, as part of the URL, we're specifying where in that URL we can locate the controller and the action and any additional parameters. An additional thing you should know is that if you are mapping additional routes in your MVC project, it's going to go in order. So it's going to look through the templates in order of how you add them to this route. So if the URL gets passed in and it can match this route first, then that's where it's going to go. Okay, so if you have a controller called members, then there's a good chance that this default route will try to look there first for the action that's supposed to be going to. So just be aware of that, as you map more additional routes to the routes object, that they do go in order until it can find the first template that matches the URL that's been requested by the user. So hopefully you understand routing better. I know for a lot of people, it's kind of that last big puzzle piece to how MVC works in general. There's obviously a lot more bells and whistles that we'll be going through, but I think just based upon the videos you've seen here, you can already start to form a shape of how to make MVC work for you to display pages to your users and make a pretty general and basic website for yourself. So we obviously will be going into much more of those bells and whistles, razor views, a bit more about controllers and models and how to go into entity framework and all that good stuff. But hopefully you guys have a good enough understanding at this point that you can probably actually start to form your own websites and get started on planning things out for yourself. And then we'll add some of those bells and whistles a little bit later. So anyway, we're going to continue on here. I hope you guys are enjoying this series, and I look forward to making the next video for you.